Hello and welcome to a webinar of the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty and the National Network for Youth on our new updated report, Alone Without a Home, a national review of state laws affecting unaccompanied youth, which covers the laws and policies in effect in all 50 states and 6 U.S. territories. I'm here today with some colleagues from the National Network for Youth, Amy Loudit, and a member of their National Youth Advisory Council, Sharday Hamilton, as well as our volunteer attorney, Marta Barrison. I'm Eric Tars. I'm the legal director at the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. We are a national organization dedicated solely to using the power of the law to end and prevent homelessness, working across litigation, policy, advocacy, public education, and training and support, like producing this manual and conducting this webinar to share it with all of you. We're very excited about it, and I'm going to turn over to Amy to tell you a little bit about the National Network.
Hey everyone, so I'm sure that many of you that are on the line have interacted with the National Network before. We've been around since 1974. We are focused solely on ensuring a future where all young people that are experiencing homelessness or family conflict outside of their home have a safe place to call home. We want to make sure that we are mobilizing our collective power and expertise from our national community, from the federal level to the state level to the local level, influencing public policy and laws that are impacting and creating barriers in some cases to young people experiencing homelessness and their ability to be successful. So we're going to go to the next slide. The National Network for Youth collaborates greatly on a number of different levels and issues, trying to protect young people from getting caught up in the criminal justice system, avoiding child welfare if at all possible, keeping families together when we can, trying to protect them from victimization. The longer that they're on the streets, we know the more vulnerable they are to trafficking. We want to keep them out of the chronically homeless adult systems and make sure that we have treatments in place for them. We work with government agencies, like I said, collaborating at the community level with providers from both public and private sector and young people themselves, which is why we are so excited to have Sharday on the line with us. So with that, I will turn it back over to Eric.
Great, thanks, Amy. And since now you know a little bit about us, let's find out a little bit about you. You should have a poll in front of you now asking if you are a service provider, about how many youth your agency works with annually. And go ahead and put in your answers. And I'll leave it up there for another few seconds. Just click, and we'll wrap up the poll. So, yep. It looks like, let's see if I can share this with everybody. It looks like about 40% of you said that you serve between 1 and 500 each year. 14% are over 1,000, and 4% or 5,000, and 34% aren't service providers, and it wasn't applicable. So thanks for that. So moving on, we are here today to talk about our report, some of the background, who are unaccompanied youth, what kinds of challenges do they face. Then we'll highlight some of the findings of our report, including some of the best practices from certain states. And although we can't fit all of the 400 pages of this report into this hour, we'll try and share some of the highlights and share some of our key recommendations as well. We will conclude at the end with a opportunity for questions and answers. And although you as a participant cannot speak during the webinar, you'll see on your sidebar a comment box outlined here in red that you can type in your questions, which can be then read at the end of the presentation, and we'll be able to respond. And just as a note, today's presentation is being recorded, and it may be posted as a resource. So if you have any privacy concerns or anything, just be aware that that the webinar may be posted later for those purposes. So with that, I wanted to turn over to Sharday. Both the Law Center and the National Network feel it's very important to have this work led by people who are directly affected by it, and Sharday is a member of the National Network's Youth Advisory Council. And so, Sharday, can you just tell us from your perspective why people should care about these laws?
Well, I just want to thank everyone for joining this webinar, taking time out your busy days. I'm Sharday, and I'm on the National Network for Youth Advisory Council. This work is something I am very passionate about because it's something that I struggled with for 3 years, experiencing different obstacles to find stable housing. It is very important that you as providers have access to different youth voices in your city. The voice of someone who is experiencing the trouble that you are fighting for has great power. You will be able to learn the barriers and problems that we face as youth day to day. The Alone Without a Home resource we're talking about will help you be able to navigate through these barriers and problems that each of these youth you're helping are facing. I am going to be talking a bit through this presentation about how some of these barriers came up for me to call attention to how youth providers may see them come up for your young people. Listen to the youth sitting in front of you and turn to this guide to help you become a better advocate. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Sharday. And I will turn over now to Amy to talk about some of the many factors and the background about beyond your personal story, Sharday, and let's look at the national picture. Amy?
Hey, thanks, Eric. This is Amy, Public Policy Associate with National Network. So what I want to talk about right now are some of the background numbers, and we have struggled for many, many years to figure out exactly how many young people are experiencing homelessness, because we know that young people have a healthy fear of child welfare involvement, law enforcement involvement, their peers. Frankly, nobody wants to be in high school or middle school and have their peers in class know that they're experiencing homelessness. So they've gotten very, very good at being able to hide and blend in. And so Voices of Youth Count was a study done in collaboration with Chapin Hall and was released last year. And what we came up with number-wise was that over a year, 4.2 million youth were experiencing homelessness, and 700,000 of them were unaccompanied minors specifically. So 3.5 are within that 18 to 24 range, and 700,000 are under 18 years old. We know that that is still an undercount because of the issues that I pointed out before, but beyond that, what we're looking at are what we need to do to help these young people. We know now that up to 29% report having some sort of substance abuse problem, and 69% say that they need help with mental health issues. We can go to the next slide. Beyond those numbers, we had 33% interacting with the foster care system, and we know that many bad foster care placements lead to foster care and child welfare involved youth running away even from their foster care placement. And so the providers on the front lines are really the ones that are trying to help with that and figure out how to get a better placement for them. 50% of our young people have been in juvenile detention, jail, or prison. Many times that comes up with status offense laws, and we'll talk about that later. 27% of LGBTQ identified youth experiencing homelessness have exchanged sex to meet basic needs. Food, shelter, someplace to sleep, that sort of thing. And then 62% of LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness have already reported being physically harmed in some way, whether it was assault, whether it was sexual assault or physical assault. Okay, next slide. Right now, we're looking at the challenges that face many youth experiencing homelessness, whether they are couch surfing on a family friend's couch or a stranger's couch or out on the streets. There's an inability to obtain basic necessities, barriers to food stamps, barriers to food altogether, and we'll talk about all of those federal benefits as we go through this as well. There's a high risk of involvement with the justice system, as we talked about, and that's not just the juvenile justice system, but courts in general, and a lack of access to legal services to help navigate those systems. There's, as we pointed out, the fearful avoidance of intervention with child welfare. Many young people have had experience with child welfare in the past, and so they don't want to be involved again. As well as law enforcement. Nobody wants an intervention with law enforcement. So then there's the lack of wraparound services that happen after we meet a young person and know that they need help, and that's a lot of the advocacy that we do here in Washington, D.C. is trying to secure more federal funds so that we have more resources for those wraparound services. And then there's no knowledge of or young people are frequently misinformed of the services that are available in their communities, and sometimes that's purposeful, just in that there's not enough to really advertise to say, hey, we're here, and sometimes that's just poor placement of letting young people know. We know from our providers and folks on the ground that the best way to draw a young person to a program is through street outreach and peer-to-peer. So word of mouth is absolutely the number one way that we end up with folks in our programs. Some of those, the topics that we're going to, that are in Alone Without a Home are all here on this list. We're not going to touch all of them, as Eric very pointed out. We don't have time to put a 400-page document into an hour. So just be aware, all of these issues are spelled out in the guide, in the report itself. We can go to the next slide. So who is a youth? This is looking at that statutory age of youth versus young adult. 48 states set 18 years old as the age of majority. 12 include an actual definition of youth in their state statutes, and that establishes some measure of protection for some of the older youth and differentiating their needs from younger children. So there is one state that I am aware of offhand that the age of majority actually doesn't start until 21. No contracts can be signed in Colorado. You can't consent to get your own photo identification in Colorado unless you're 21 or older. So with that, let's move into those definitions and some of the barriers that they create. 20 jurisdictions explicitly define homeless child, homeless youth, homeless minor, homeless student, which allows, especially with homeless student, it allows greater protections with our schools, and advocates are empowered with having those definitions. It gives the ability for lawyers and legal aid services to advocate on their behalf as far as what they're eligible for. 19 jurisdictions are explicitly defining runaway, habitual runaway, and chronic runaway, and many times those definitions are used in a derogatory manner, which does not necessarily help them get the resources that they need. It frequently can ensnare them even further with law enforcement or child welfare. Charday, would you be so kind as to talk about some of the barriers that some definitions have maybe created for you as far as getting access to services? Can we unmute Charday?
I'm sorry. Hello?
Hey. Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. So a big barrier that I had faced with the word youth was obtaining an ID. Also being a ward of the state. It was hard because of my age range. There was certain laws that you needed a guardian for. So when I was homeless, I wasn't able to get certain services for my daughter. So I wasn't able to get a WIC card, an ID, because I didn't have a guardian due to she had passed away. So those are a couple of barriers that I have faced.
Thanks.
Amy?
Yep. So we can move to the next slide. So New Jersey has pretty decent a pretty decent statute as far as young people and their definitions and terminologies. So they include people that are 21 years of age or younger in their definition of youth. And they acknowledge that the older young people are still in need of appropriate care and supervision. And the reason that that's important is because frequently we think that 18 is this magic number, and everything changes and you're an adult, and you should, be subjected to shelters that are adult appropriate and not youth appropriate. But we know that the adolescent brain doesn't stop developing until around 25 years old. So we really appreciate the state taking those matters into their own hands and saying, no, we need to do something about that. Missouri law specifies a wide variety of important contracts that minors can enter, which is helpful as well. They include things like housing, employment, automobile purchases, student loans, admission to school, medical care, bank accounts, admission to domestic violence and homeless shelters. So it's there are a number of really good state definitions and statutes out there. I encourage you to take a look at that chapter, not only in here, but also our state-by-state definition guide on our website as well, National Network for Youth. We will move now into photo identification and the issues with that. Charday, do you want to give me your quote about not having an ID?
Whatever ID, you are nobody. You are not considered. You are considered nobody. Well, in the state of Illinois, you are.
Yeah, and that's the unfortunate reality for a lot of our youth across the country. There are so many conflicting requirements, right? You can't get an ID without having a birth certificate, but you can't get a birth certificate without showing photo identification in many states. So it's this carousel of problems for especially young people that are trying to navigate this on their own. We do have 14 states that are currently waiving or reducing fees for non-driver photo identification, specifically for individuals experiencing homelessness. There are many more states that include things like if you're about to be voting age and the next year is an election year, things like that, disabilities, all sorts of different things that states will waive or reduce fees for. But experiencing homelessness specifically is only happening in 14 states. 30 states are still requiring a parent or guardian to be present to apply for or sign the application, and that's actually dropped down, or it's actually up to 36 now, I believe, including parental consent that's required to get a birth certificate as well. So there's 36 states altogether that between needing a parent to get a photo ID or needing a parent to obtain a birth certificate if you're under 18 years old, or if you're under 21 in Colorado. Without an ID, you can't get a job, you can't enroll in higher education, you
can't do nothing.
Yeah, you can't get federal buildings if you're here in DC. It's a huge barrier. So
Can't get milk for your children.
right.
Can't get food at certain food pantries without proof of address, and you need proof of address on your ID. It's hard out here without an ID.
Absolutely. So we can move to the next slide, please. One of the best practices that I found when we were doing our research was the state of New York has an actual statement of identity form that tries to help out with the identity issue, with meeting the proof of identity issues. We can definitely read more about that in our field guide, which has just been updated and added to our website as well. Okay, we can move to the next slide. With that, I will turn it over to Marta.
Thank you, Amy. This is Marta Barrison at the National Law Center. I'm a volunteer attorney here, and I've worked for many years with folks experiencing homelessness in DC, including youth. And the next 3 slides I'm going to talk about are related to status offenses, which are acts that are usually not considered criminal, but are criminally punishable when performed by minors. And the most common of those are examined in our report, and those are running away, truancy from school, and violating citywide curfews. So minors run away for a myriad of reasons, just to start with running away. The most prevalent ones being abuse or neglect, or being kicked out, which is often a result of disclosing a pregnancy, LGBTQ status, or sexual abuse. So let's say you're 15 years old and you leave home due to abuse. What challenges are you going to face? First of all, the second you step out the door, you could be committing a criminal act. In almost all jurisdictions, they explicitly allow police to take runaway youth into custody without their consent and without a warrant. 11 explicitly classify youth who run away as delinquent or classify runaway as a status offense. And 45 jurisdictions allow police to return youth home without considering the youth's wishes, and that's actually up from 9 jurisdictions in 2012. 5 jurisdictions statutorily allow runaway youth to be held with juvenile offenders. And we think that's quite prevalent in other states, even where we're not we're not explicitly allowed by statute. On the other end of the scale, Connecticut, Illinois, and Oregon take a more progressive approach to addressing the needs of youth who run away. And those would be good states for advocates to look to for model legislation. They display both concern for the safety of young people as well as their needs and dignity, and including the importance of their voice in the decisions that are being made about them. I just also want to mention that while purportedly designed to protect young people from harm and victimization, status offenses severely restrict the rights of young people and really entangle them with the juvenile justice system unnecessarily and for nonviolent offenses. And there's been a lot of studies that have shown that girls, youth of color, LGBTQ youth, and poor youth are disproportionately subjected to harsher punishments for status offenses. Can you go on to the next slide, Eric? So if it's after dark and you've been out on the streets, you could also be liable for a curfew violation. Many states authorize curfews, and many more cities and localities have them on the books. And again, it's far preferable to provide young people with services rather than punishing them for behavior they can't avoid, like curfew violations. Curfew laws unnecessarily involve young people with the criminal justice system and really restrict their mobility and criminalize normal and often necessary behavior. And while a lot of these laws have exemptions for employment and education and other things that might cause a young person to be out after curfew, they still expose far too many young people to unnecessary juvenile justice involvement. And in fact, there's much debate nationally over whether curfew laws actually keep young people safe and prevent crime or simply expose them to criminal justice involvement. And 39 jurisdictions explicitly authorize curfews on the books for statewide curfews or for local jurisdictions to enact curfews. Next slide. With regard to truancy, if you've spent the night trying to sleep on a cold hallway floor outside a friend's apartment, how many young people who've done that are going to make it to school the next morning at 8, 10 a.m.? Truancy is a status offense or considered delinquent in 11 jurisdictions. These states take a punitive approach rather than trying to find out what is at the root cause of attendance issues. And truancy consequences can include penalties like fines, community service, and driver's license suspension, which are really counterproductive. Instead, the report discusses that jurisdictions should identify students in need of stable housing, transportation, and other assistance, which is consistent with federal law, and should adopt trauma-informed responses to school disciplinary issues, including truancy. And I just want to point advocates to the laws in both Florida and Texas. Both of these laws require schools to identify the causes of absences and then address the causes and remove the barriers to attendance. They take a totally non-punitive approach, and I would really encourage listeners to look up those two state laws if you're looking for some model legislation to advocate for in your jurisdiction. And with that, I will turn it over to Amy, I believe, or Eric.
No, back to me. Thank you, Marta. So, for a youth who's out on the streets, again, say you're able to avoid looking suspicious, you're able to stay in school, and maybe you're old enough that you can leave school or work for full time. Maybe you want to rent your own apartment or need to buy a car, but as a minor, unaccompanied homeless youth might be unable legally to obtain housing, buy these essential goods, and engage in the other transactions that are necessary to live independently or to make their own decisions about medical care, education, and other personal matters. Emancipation allows a young person to become a legal adult while he or she is still under the legal age of majority. And in 33 states, you can apply for emancipation, but in 15 of those, parental consent is required. So if you have an abusive parent who just wants you back or to abuse you, the chances are that you won't be able to get emancipated. And if you are only 14 or 15, you can only 6 jurisdictions allow for emancipation in those circumstances. So this is still an area that there's really wide disparities in practices across the country. A few jurisdictions, like Indiana, recognize that youth mature at different rates, and so Indiana does not establish a minimum age for emancipation. It does not require parental consent. All that youth have to do is state that they wish to be independent and make some demonstration that they can support themselves, and they have to be able to show that they have acceptable living arrangements and understand the consequences of emancipation. This statute protects a young person's right to become legally independent, but it also requires a court to ensure that the youth really understands what that means and that they have a safe place to live. So we really think Indiana kind of strikes the right balance in terms of enabling youth to live on their own while making sure that there are some protections and that the court can exercise some judgment in making sure that they are able to meet all their needs. as another example, the Virgin Islands allows for emancipation, but it keeps some protections in place even after that, so they don't become full legal adults. There are some limitations on the size of contracts and on their ability to appear in lawsuits or sell real property, just again to provide that extra level of protection for the youth. On the topic of education, the federal McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act establishes the right of homeless children and youth to access education. It was updated in 2015 as part of the Every Student Succeeds Act, but the majority of states have lagged in putting into place some of the new protections, and our report covers some of the differences and the ones that are moving forward and the ones that have not yet. And with that, I'll turn back over to Amy to talk about access to healthcare.
Hey everyone. So as you can see, unaccompanied youth are facing hurdles in accessing healthcare as well, due to both financial and consent and confidentiality issues and laws that are creating barriers. Only 36 jurisdictions enable unaccompanied youth under 18 to apply for healthcare coverage without the need for parental consent in at least some situations. As part of the ACA, there was a very small provision in there requiring states that were interacting with that to actually do street outreach and do outreach for unaccompanied youth experiencing homelessness under 18. Problem being that you have to apply and you can't put tax information in if you're a minor who hasn't had a job. So there, even though that's there, it's still a wonky barrier to be aware of. 31 jurisdictions have explicit policies permitting unaccompanied youth to apply for health insurance coverage. 5 jurisdictions have informal policies permitting unaccompanied youth to apply for the health insurance coverage itself. And so that's, great that they are doing that, but formal policies make things a little bit clearer for the courts and for legal advocates. One jurisdiction won't allow unaccompanied youth to apply for CHIP, Children's Health Insurance Program, but does permit them to apply for general Medicare or Medicaid. So 35 states have separate children health insurance programs and use an integrated application system where a youth eligibility is considered for both for CHIP as well as Medicaid. But at least 14 are requiring formally or informally still a parent or adult guardian in order to apply for that coverage. Next slide. So in addition to looking at access to healthcare, we looked pretty widely at a variety of consent requirements across many jurisdictions. Jurisdictions vary widely in terms of the specific procedures that a youth can consent for, including treatment for mental illness and substance abuse, treatment and testing for STDs or abortions, and examination and treatment relating to sexual assault is still being widely between places. So with that, Sharday, do you have anything to chime in as far as trying to get access to healthcare as a minor?
Yeah, it definitely was difficult for me to get healthcare for me and my child when I was a minor because I needed parent consent. So I had to go through DCFS, different other organizations in order to find healthcare. That's like due to the fact that I was under the age of 18. So it's definitely a lot of barriers out here for healthcare.
Thank you for sharing, Sharday. Marta, I will kick it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Amy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about two federal public benefits programs, TANF, which is Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, and SNAP, which is the new food stamp program, newish. TANF can provide homeless youth who have children with cash assistance to meet their survival needs, and that can be really important for young people who are staying from pillar to post, couch surfing. Sometimes they can find a friend who they might be able to stay with if they contribute a little bit of money to the household. And SNAP provides food purchase assistance to families or individuals, and the federal guidances specifically include unaccompanied youth as being eligible for SNAP benefits. But there are pretty restrictive program requirements for TANF, and one of those is the requirement that youth be living with their parent, which obviously poses a huge barrier for all unaccompanied youth and for their access to TANF benefits. Before I get into the statistics, Sharday, can you talk a little bit about what kinds of barriers you faced in applying for either food stamps or TANF, or that you're aware of that young people face when applying for these benefits?
Most of the benefits in order to receive food stamps for TANF, you have to have a stable housing. Even though now they give you the assistance to have homes, but you need to have a stable address for you to receive mail. You need to have proof of address. Some people don't even allow you to get food stamps if you stay at a shelter because it's not permanent. Some days you go in and you have to leave, so it's not a permanent address. With TANF, you have to be looking for a job. So in order to look for a job, you need to have an ID or a stable place to get mail. So they don't let a lot of homeless youth receive TANF if they don't have a stable address or a guardian that they can put down.
Great, thank you. So 47 states do provide some type of exemption from the living with a parent requirement, and these include that there's no parent or guardian available, the health or safety of the young person would be jeopardized, and other types of good cause exemptions. 17 jurisdictions require minors who do meet one of those exemptions to live in an adult supervised home. 17 provide work or education exemptions, and to the TANF work and school requirements for young people. Only 9 supply or subsidize childcare for eligible minors with children when employment or school is required. And I just wanted to point out also that only 3 jurisdictions include a cash incentive for youth who graduate from high school or earn a GED, which we consider to be a really good best practice. The federal guidelines on SNAP and the state ones are much more flexible, allowing minors to be eligible as their own household and recognizing that unaccompanied youth will not necessarily have an address to use. But as Sharday's example shows, a lot of local jurisdictions don't always follow those federal guidances, and advocacy is really often necessary to help young people access SNAP as well as TANF. One of the best practices that we wanted to point out was California, which does have a good cause exemption to the living with a parent requirement. And an adult supervised environment is not required for those young people who meet that good cause exemption, meaning they can be living on their own in an independent living environment. There are child care subsidies and education incentives. Next slide. And then finally, Arkansas as well has a lot of those exemptions and also provides for transportation, childcare, case management, and mentoring while the minor parent is participating in education-related activities. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Amy and Sharday.
Hey, thanks. So we've covered a whole bunch already, but one of the key access issues that we see on the ground and with our providers are barriers to shelters and services. At least 25 jurisdictions regulate runaway and homeless youth shelters and programs through a broader child caring license. And that can be great. It can also create issues, especially when you have blended funding coming from different funding streams from the federal government as well as state government. At least 15 jurisdictions explicitly authorize expenditure of funds or authorize local units of government to expend those funds for programs and services targeted specifically to runaway and homeless youth. And at least 12 authorize the expenditure of those funds for homeless services without specifying if it's supposed to be focused on homeless youth, and many times those funds end up getting absorbed by the adult providers in the community. So if we go to the next slide. So what are shelters and services that are youth appropriate really good at? They're great at adaptation and growth, meaning that they have the flexibility built into their programming to be able to help a young person who's dealing with all of these different barriers that we've been talking about, or at least knowing where to point the young person to for legal services, say, or a healthcare physician. Runaway and homeless youth programs specifically have three different branches. There's street outreach, which helps bring the young people into a program. Street outreach is very closely related to drop-in centers, which allow a place for young people to go, a safe place for young people to go during the day. Basic shelters are those basic center programs, those emergency shelters in the adult world. And so they are a shorter term, currently up to 21-day stay for minors specifically. And then independent living very, very frequently are transitional living programs. And so they're still supervised, they're still adult supervised, but frequently either a roommate situation or having their own living area within a larger house. So many programs have added some other longer term housing alternatives. Housing and Urban Development just put out a new hybrid model that they are hoping will work for young people experiencing homelessness, and that they can go from transitional living into something like a rapid rehousing, where it's completely on their own. The biggest issue with linking a young person to shelter and service is that we want to make sure that those are age appropriate, and age appropriate isn't a blanket statement saying that everybody over 18 will need this, that, or the other thing, and everybody under 18 needs services that relate to A, B, and C. It's really looking at the young person and making sure that the services that we're offering them are youth-centric, so that they are the ones that are identifying what they feel that they need at the time. Sharday, do you want to talk about getting into transitional living or your interactions with runaway and homeless youth programs?
So, I used to stay in Harvey, which is a very rural area, so I wasn't aware of none of the resources or shelters out there that was in the city of Chicago. So the way I found the shelter that I stayed at for 9 months is through my DCFS worker. She had came out and let me know that I had to move from this abandoned house that I was staying in. So once I moved from the abandoned house, I got a referral to go to a TLP, but the TLP was a drop-in center, so I wasn't able to stay the night there. And due to me being pregnant at the time, most of the shelters was you had to get all your stuff. Once you go there that night, you had to leave the next day with all your stuff. So I wasn't really feeling that because I'm like, it's cold outside, I'm pregnant, and I gotta transport my stuff every day. So I end up finding a pregnant and parenting program for youth. up to the age of 21. And I stayed there for 9 months until I found stable housing.
Thanks for sharing that, Sade. Um, so we go into discharge from juvenile justice. This is another huge area that we see problems with youth either being held for longer than their sentencing term was because they don't have a safe place to exit to, or they're just being exited to homelessness. Or their plan for exit is not really a sound plan, and there's nobody there to follow up to make sure that they're safe and stable afterwards. So at least 12 jurisdictions have statutes that are addressing custody upon discharge, making sure that there is somebody for the young person to go to when they get out. And then only 8 jurisdictions have statutes requiring actual permanency planning for committed and adjudicated youth. Definitely an area of advocacy that we are focused on, both at the federal and state levels. So next slide. The youth released from the juvenile justice system can be at risk of being released either directly into homelessness or, as I said, to a placement that's just really not safe and stable, and they can be easily displaced. However, 25 jurisdictions direct an agency to develop some sort of procedures related to discharge or aftercare, and only 10 specifically address housing needs. So you can see there the majority of our jurisdictions just don't have any services in their plans for discharge for youth. Do you want to highlight best practices from the state of Maine? They are requiring permanency hearings, which the young person can go advocate for themselves and let everybody know what their wish is, what's going to actually be in their best interest. It doesn't force a youth to return home, quote unquote, if that's really not the best place for them to be. And then the permanency plan for youth 14 and above requires a plan for transition into independent living. So that's all. Those are all things that we really like to see coming out of juvenile justice. I will let Eric talk more about anti-harboring.
Thanks, Amy. So as we said, our report covers 13 areas. This is the last one we're going to cover right here, but there are many other areas that the report talks about as well. But we felt that this is also an important one because it talks about the provisions in law that actually either explicitly or implicitly prohibit the quote-unquote harboring of runaway youth by either individuals or organizations who don't have legal custody of that youth. And while originally enacted often to protect the rights of families to be able to raise their children and protect them from abuse, these statutes often pose a risk to those individuals and organizations that have a legitimate purpose in providing a safe haven for a young person who's currently away from their parent or guardian. And so here you see the statistics that in many states it's actually a crime to harbor a runaway or to contribute to delinquency or interfere with parental rights or otherwise conceal a minor. Alaska, like only 9 other jurisdictions, explicitly ensures that there is some protection from legal action for individuals and organizations with a reasonable justification for harboring an unaccompanied young person. There are 10 jurisdictions that allow for some kind of delayed notification between 8 and 72 hours, with Alaska giving 12 hours before you have to notify Child Protective Services of the presence of that child. And some other states make some other exceptions only for youth shelters, or they create a defense to prosecution for harboring if it's being done for the safety of the youth. Our report offers specific recommendations and best practices for this topic and for all of the other topics, but I'm going to turn back to Amy just to talk a little bit about our general recommendations and the general features of laws and policies that support services and not a punitive approach for youth. Amy, are you there? You're on mute, maybe?
Nope, I'm not on mute.
All right, you're back.
Okay, I'm back. So one of those first issues that I discussed with everybody were the definitions of unaccompanied youth being inclusive and non-judgmental, taking out those derogatory terms like incorrigible and things like that. We have a model homeless youth law that includes a definition that we think is pretty good, that we promote on our website, on National Network for Youth website. We want to end any punishment of young people that are out experiencing homelessness from getting these status offenses just because they're minors. Staying out after curfew, truancy, because you are bouncing around town, don't have a safe and stable place to stay. We also want to prioritize support and assistance over the punishment, over the punitive measures that started all of this movement 40 plus years ago. Young people are in need of help, not jails. And then we want to extend any eligibility for cash assistance to young people that we can. So making sure that they have access to food stamps and that caseworkers are informed of how to navigate those systems with a young person. So if we are talking about access to youth appropriate shelter, as we've just recently discussed, it's important to make sure that the services that are available there are youth-centric and are what the young people that are staying in that shelter actually need and say that they want. The importance of having youth action or youth advisory boards within programs cannot be stated enough, because they're the ones that are going through it. They're the ones that need that help. And that scaling up these programs really needs to include all of the youth development principles, trauma-informed care, family strengthening and family reunification practices, if that's what is safe and appropriate for the young person. With that, back to Eric.
All right. So the last kind of bucket of our recommendations really talk about ensuring that all the services are working together to make a child-centric, a youth-centric approach that will meet their needs in a supportive way, and again, not a punitive way. So working across child welfare, education, police, agencies, and workforce training on the local and federal level, merging the efforts aimed at people in need of services with runaway and homeless youth and family, and making sure that families and youth development services are all involved. So again, all of this designed to provide youth with the support they need to either live on their own, live with return to their families, or find some other situation, but in a holistic way that supports each youth. And then again, we want to empower youth with the authority to act on their own through strong emancipation statutes, provide service providers or other Good Samaritans with the ability to provide support legally to youth, and make sure that youth can act as their own agent even without emancipation in accessing health care, accessing identification and other documents, and really being able to operate in their own, as their own advocate. So with that, I'm going to transition back into a poll. Let's see here. And just, we're wondering how all the folks who are listening today will hopefully download this report and use it. Will it be as a reference for what the law is currently, as an advocacy tool for what the law should be, or a combination of both? All right, I'll give it another few seconds. All right, and we'll close the poll. And it looks like about a third of folks will use it as a reference for what the law is. Only a few are going to use it purely as an advocacy tool, but 2/3 are going to be using it for both purposes, which is great. So then next, has today's webinar provided you with a better understanding of the laws affecting unaccompanied youth? All right, another couple seconds. And I'll do it. So the good news is that the vast majority of you found today's webinar informative, and we will continue to hopefully support you in your work. And the last poll asks you how likely you are to use the information you learned today or that's in the report in your work or in your advocacy going forward. Great. All right, wrapping up. And again, it looks like the vast majority of you will be using what you've used today, so that's very encouraging for us. So that is it for our overview, which, as I said earlier, only scratches the surface of what's covered in the report. Again, I encourage you all to download the full report from our website at nlchp.org. The link is front and center on our homepage. And please, whenever you use the report, either to help an individual young person or to advocate for improving the laws for all youth, please shoot us an email and let us know. This report's required hundreds, if not thousands of hours to produce, and we want to hear what we've done right, what we could do better, and how it's making a difference. You can follow up either with myself or with Amy on any individual questions, but now if there are any questions you have for either of us, you can type them into the chat box. All right. Somebody's asking if we can share the link to the report. If you registered for the email, you will get a follow-up email that will have both the link to the report as well as technology permitting to the webinar, the recording of the webinar as well, if you want to share that with others. Yes, and so there's several people who have asked if the slides will be available. Well, we can post the slides. We can post the other information as well. The full recorded version of the webinar as well. There's a question about, have states changed their definitions of runaway and curfew in a way that's worked to decriminalize these activities, and have these legislative or regulatory changes have any positive impacts? Does anybody, either Amy or Marta, want to talk about either of those things?
I mean, I know I did mention that for the status offense of running away, that actually there's been an increase in the number of jurisdictions that allow police to return youth home without considering the youth wishes. So that's one comparison point. There's been an increase of 9 since we did the report in 2012. And I'm sure there are other places in the report where we compare, you know, what's happened over the last 7 years.
Okay. So we have another question about, let's see here.
I would also mention, Eric, that the Texas law that I pointed folks to is a new law since the last report came out. As I said, it's a really good law around truancy that requires Texas school systems to look into why a student is truant and whether the student it's because of unstable housing or other economic or social issues, and then to offer appropriate and specific support rather than criminalizing the behavior. So there's been some movement, I would say, in that direction in some jurisdictions at least.
Okay. I also just wanted to follow up and let people know that if they follow us on Twitter, the report link is also posted to our Twitter account at nlchp.org or at nlchphomeless.org, not .org, just at nlchphomeless. And it's up on our website already. Several folks have asked if it's available to print. You can definitely download it and print it out on your own. As I said, it's 400 pages, so think about paper as you're using it, but it's definitely available for folks to look at on their computers as well in PDF format. And somebody asked if there's a website where we can access the information based on their state. So the report is organized in chapters according to topic area, but then each chapter has an appendix with the laws in all 50 states plus 6 other territories. So you can see all of it. Every state or jurisdiction is reflected there. The research was done as of several months ago, so things can change. So, anything that you see in there, make sure, it'll give you the citation to the law, so you can always look up on your own state's, statutory legislation website and see if any changes have been made. But it's a good place to start. We have a question about what options do youth have who were previously homeless if they make enough money to live on their own, but the housing situations are expensive and on the West Coast, and they're couch surfing. I think it's as we said, the laws for accessing cash assistance like TANF are challenging. Youth aren't able to apply for many other kind of housing or federal benefits on their own. They need to either be age of majority or living in a family. So I don't know, Amy or Marta, if you want to say about that.
Yeah, I think if there are, if we're talking about a minor who is working and making enough money to live on their own, that certainly would not take them out of running for a place at a transitional living program, especially if they are on their own due to safety concerns at quote unquote home. But affordable housing is a problem for, I think, anybody over the age of 18, especially on the West Coast, and here in Washington D.C. as well. Voucher programs are out there. Wait lists are really long, and so it's difficult, I think, for everybody right now. That if we're talking about the older adults, that's a completely different ballgame. So, Marta, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, the only thing I would add, I guess, is that I think, at least my experience in DC has been that the shelter options are also really limited for unaccompanied youth. And that's something that we need to be doing a lot more advocacy around in many jurisdictions. I know that there's, maybe a dozen or a couple dozen spaces for unaccompanied youth who are minors in DC to be in shelter. And even those spaces, I believe, they have to be reunited with their families within 72 hours or usually go into the foster care system. So with minors, it's a very, it's a challenging issue because of the involvement of child welfare and jurisdictions' concerns about minors living on their own.
All right. Thank you. So just time for a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up. Somebody asked, when we speak about jurisdictions, are we speaking about states? We use the term jurisdiction because this covers both states, plus the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Marshall Islands, etc. So that's why we were using the term jurisdiction. But in general, we're talking about the different states. Someone from Ohio is asking who they should write to advocate for changes in the kind of catch-22 problems with getting IDs and birth certificates, social security cards, etc. Amy, do you have any thoughts about targets for advocacy on ID issues?
Yeah, so I know the Ohio Poverty Law Center is looking at those issues as well. I'm happy to have a discussion. I'm having a discussion with them coming up soon about advocacy issues around many of those issues. So if you want to give me your contact, I'm happy to loop you into that discussion as well. Ohio is one of the most burdensome places for young people, for minors specifically, to be able to consent to things like their own health care, for example, and photo ID. Pennsylvania is actually the most burdensome state for a young person to get a photo ID. Ohio does have an unwritten internal policy for IDs that, yes, there's parental consent requirement for them to obtain one. However, from their internal office, they will train DMV employees to accept any adult willing to take responsibility. And when we're talking about a photo identification, we're not talking about liabilities the same liabilities of a young person behind the wheel of a vehicle. So just some things to keep in mind. As those strategies move forward, I would love to know who it is that was asking about that and get their contact information and follow up.
Yep, she put it into the question box and I'll get it to you afterwards, Amy. And obviously, Amy's information is up on your screens now, so feel free to reach out directly. I have one question I'd like to direct to Sharday, which is what program or agency was most helpful to you while you were homeless, and what really made a difference for you?
The program at agency that was most helpful for me was the night ministry. They helped me with all the resources that I needed to obtain the ID. I was able to obtain my ID, birth certificate. They helped me receive medical for me and my 2 kids. And they helped me find stable housing. And then after I found stable housing, they helped me with an appointment. And I've been working with them for a year now as a peer outreach professional. So that's the agency that helped me the most. What was the other question, Eric?
What kind of really made a difference for you?
What really made a difference for me was the case manager. She came into my life and she stuck by me as a mother. So having steady case managers definitely helped, and definitely having a bond with the staff members there. They was able to understand, they was a listening ear for my troubles, and not to have a place where I didn't have to leave every day. That it was a 180-day program, but they let me stay there as long as I was doing what I was needed to do.
All right, and so last question that we'll take now is, about which states are best and which states are worst overall for homeless youth. From my perspective, there's definitely no perfect state out there, and the issues that we cover here are so wide-ranging. Some states are great in some areas and terrible in others. So it's really hard to say a best and a worst. We do have, as an additional resource, the state index on youth homelessness, which we produced in partnership with the True Colors Fund, that does give state-by-state rankings. But I would note that on that state index, there's no state that even gets a passing grade. There's a lot of room for improvement out there. Amy, obviously you just said that Pennsylvania has it worst when it comes to IDs. And Ohio makes it overall challenging. Do you have any kind of best or worst feelings?
Yeah, I worked, before I came to Washington, D.C., I did state policy work in California, and California has been really progressive over the past 6 or 7 years in essablishing laws that benefit runaway and homeless youth, both in the programmatic world, the systemic world, and education as well. So their access to healthcare laws for youth experiencing homelessness or unaccompanied youth on their own are really, really expansive. They cover all of those confidential medical services that we discussed, as well as general medical care. So, and I know Chicago and Illinois were doing a lot of work around access to healthcare as well a few years ago through the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. I would definitely say that California is probably moving in the direction of being a model state as far as overall access to programs and services is concerned.
Great. Well, thank you to our co-presenters. Thank you to all of you for listening today. As I said, you will all get a follow-up email with links to some of these things. If we didn't get to your specific question, we will try and follow up individually afterwards. And please feel free, as I said, again, to reach out to either Amy or myself with any questions. And please, please, please tell us how you are using this report, if it's useful to you, if there's areas we can improve. There will likely be a future edition of this, and we would like it to be even bigger and better. So please help us do that. And with that, we'll say goodbye for now, and hopefully this recording will be posted in the next few days if people want to watch again or share with others. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.